Hello everybody and welcome to today's ecology class. For today's class I plan to talk about food chains and webs and also a bit about keystone species. My name is Divna, so let's start. So the energy, as we mentioned in the previous presentations, is fixed by plants and it presents the base for the rest of life on Earth, that energy that life depends on. So this energy stored by plants is passed along through the ecosystem in a series of steps of eating and being eaten. So this process is also known as a food chain. So as you can see, it's a linear system, but in reality it's actually just a small part of something much more complicated, of something like this. And this is known as a food web. But we will talk a bit more about this later. Okay, so back to the food chain. In this linear road, if you go from first link to the last one, by each step a bit of energy is lost. All organisms that obtain their energy in the same number of steps from the Autotrophs, or primary producers, they belong to the same trophic level in the ecosystem. So the trophic level, as written here, is representing the position of the organism which it holds in the food chain. So that's what the food chain represents in comparison to food web. So it's the simpler food web presentation where each representative is basically represent a trophic level. So you have a one representative in front of the whole trophic level, which in generally it's presented much wider in a food web. Okay, so here you have different trophic levels. So in there you have producers, and then you have herbivores, and then you have different levels of carnivores. So until the moment of a top predator. Okay, it's important to mention that within any ecosystem, some consumers can occupy a single trophic level. It's more usual to occupy more than one trophic level, and that's the case with omnivores. And they are what is called the opportunistic feeders. So it means they prey choice is wider than with the animals users that occupy only a single trophic level. Okay, so next we'll mention that any ecosystem, whatever it is always represented in two major food chains. So the grazing food chain and the detrital food chain, each ecosystem. And this is how they look like. Grazing food chain down the road and detrital food chain. The distinction between these two food chains is the source of energy for the first level consumers or herbivores. In the grazing food chain, with this one, the source of energy is living plant biomass or net primary production. And then in the detrital food chain, this level of consumers, the source of energy for them is a dead organic matter or detritus. Let's talk about these arrows representing interactions between separate parts of these food chains. Orange arrow represents the linkage between trophic levels and the matter of flow of energy associated with ingestion. Then we have a blue arrow that goes from each trophic level, and it represents the loss of energy through respiration. And then the brown arrows, they represent a combination of dead organic matter and the waste product, the metabolic waste product like feces or urine and so on. So this is a typical flow of energy in a grazing food chain, and this would be the process of a detrital food chain energy flow, like typical presentation of it. Also, the other difference between grazing and detrital food chain is that the grazing food chain is unidirectional, which means that energy flows by strict order or of trophic levels, while in detrital food chain, the energy is always recycling because each trophic level is contributing to the base of chain, so the so-called primary producer, so the base level of energy source. Each of the levels are inputting a bit of their energy down to the detrital composition of energy source for the detrital food chain. Still, there is a story about top predator trophic level, and its influence in the trophic chain is a bit blurry because its contribution, for example, we have an insectivorous bird which would be a top predator, and it can also prey on one hand on a beetle species that would feed on detritus, but also it can choose for food a species that feeds on a green leaf tissues. So their influence in the chain is a bit unclear. So as mentioned earlier, the food chain is just a simple presentation of in practice super complicated food web. So this is a simpler presentation of this hypothetical food web, and it's presented here to illustrate the basic terminology used to describe the structure of the food web. So similar to the food chain, which is linear, as we said before, here each circle represents a species, and the arrows from the consumers to consumers up to the food web are termed links. So all these species in the food web are distinguished by whether they are basal species, is here, basal, intermediate, or predator species. So the basal species feed on no other species but are fed upon the others. And then we have intermediate species that feed on other species and they are also prey of other species. And then you have top predators. They are not subject to predation. They prey on intermediate and basal species, so everyone below their position in the food web. These terms refer to the structure of the web, actually, rather than the strict biological reality which can really meet in the nature. And here is how it would look like in the nature. So as you can see, the realistic food web can be super complex, especially in the high biodiversity ecosystems, thousands and thousands of links. As for the food chain, they usually simplify it and represent it with trophic level instead of each representative separately, each species. So this is how it looks like in reality, and this is how it is represented in the scheme in a more simplified way and easier to work on. This is a grassland biodiversity food web. So next to these one-directional relationship between species that is shown, there are different types of interactions. So for example, an analysis of mechanisms controlling community structures. For example, predator may reduce the competition between two prey species by controlling their population size below their respective carrying capacity. So this must include these indirect effects represented by structure of the food web, and this is something we'll talk about in the next slide. So here are represented the indirect interactions between links in the food web. And these indirect interactions occur when one species does not interact with the second species directly, but instead it's influencing a third species that does directly influence with the second one. In general, this would be a story or a subject we talked about in one of the first presentations I gave you, and it's about species relations. So you have, for example, a predation or mutualism or parasitism. I hope I refreshed your memory. So here you have some examples of these types of relationships, but only presented as indirect representation. The A case is the story of two consumers sharing a common prey may compete indirectly via classical exploitation competition. Then the B case is that when two prey species may only appear to compete because of either increases or shared predator also increases, but which operates to the determinant of the other prey population. Then C is a population of three species at the same trophic level, arranged so that the one species, the P2, is basically sandwiched between two others. So population P1 and P3 are indirectly mutualist because each inhabits with the other's competitor, so P2. The D scenario would be a more complex four-species system, and this results in an indirect mutualism or facilitation. So in this case, populations C1 and C2, which do not interact directly, but consume different prey species, they interact indirectly because their prey compete, and if consumer C2 increases, its prey P2 will decrease, of course, which in return reduces competition with P1 and then providing more food for consumer species C1. And the last case would be case E, and it's a trophic cascade, and all these populations of three different species are in different trophic levels, so have three trophic levels. And then the plant P1 and the carnivore C1 are indirect mutualists because they share an herbivore species H1. So these would be some of the examples, the numerous other stories of indirect interactions that are also possible, but it's an important matter to think about. Okay, so this is just a scheme with the proper food chain and how it looks like, with arrows showing direct and indirect interactions between the common species interactions like predation and consumption and so on. The key feature of indirect interaction is that they can potentially arise throughout the entire community because of a single direct interactions between only two component species. And this is the story of Keystone Species, a really nice and brainstorming concept. So the concept of Keystone Species, as shown on this nice image, is that keystone is something that it's holding the whole thing together. So if you move a only single thing in the system, everything will fall apart and crash. So keystone species in the matter of ecology have a very important role in the ecosystem they live in, and their role is to keep the fragile balance of a perfect functioning of its ecosystem. The one really well-known example of this story is a sea otter case as a keystone species. Sea otter is a keystone predator in the northern Pacific. Okay, so sea otter, by its nature, is feeding on sea urchins, which then feed on kelp. So here's the sea otter is feeding on the sea urchin, which feeds on kelp. In areas where sea otters are abundant, the sea urchins are rare, and then the kelp forest is well developed. As we all know, the kelps are really important in each ecosystem that they're present in because of the oxygen producer, the hiding place for young ones for different fish species, and so on. And then, over the last 20 years, killer whales have been preying on sea otters more than usual, especially in Alaska, since the whale's usual prey has declined. And this is the story about the climate change and global warming and the shifting of species. So the decline of sea otter as a keystone species has allowed the sea urchin population to increase, and this resulted in destruction of the kelp forest. So this is the story. We have a new top predator eating a previous top predator, much so really decreasing its populations, which would leave sea urchins to thrive since they don't have a pressure from their usual predator, And then more sea urchin means less kelp, because that's what they feed on, and this is graphs representing this. So sea otter abundance is falling down, which would cause sea urchin biomass to increase, and then the decreasing of kelp is following. So this is a nice story of a specific role that each keystone species is holding in the ecosystem, and its really important role of keeping the functioning of the ecosystem the way all its parts are used to through the evolution and their development. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Bye.